It's me again. So this week I decided to talk about something I feel a lot of people have very weird misconceptions about, and also something I think people don't really think through when they're setting up their car. That's add-on weights, and yeah, let's just get into it. All right. So the issue with add-on weights is, if you think about it, and think about real race cars, the only and the single good reason to add weight to the car is to reach the minimum weight limit. There really isn't any good reason to add weight to your car. And it shouldn't ever, and it does really not ever make your car better. But there's sort of a catch to this, because a lot of people, a lot of pros, and a lot of actually good people who set up their car properly sometimes have to use add-on weights. But that doesn't still mean that they are a good setup option. It just means that sometimes they work, because sometimes the car setup needs a band-aid. Band-aid means that it's there just to fix something else. And always, if you want to build a good car, you should always fix the issue before putting on weights. Having to add weight to make your car work better just means that your setup is made for a heavier car. You need to figure out a setup that suits your car weight. It's almost impossible to have a too light car. Obviously, if your car is so light that it just can't produce enough force on the tires, then yeah, you can have a too light car. But generally, our cars have more than enough weight to do that. So it really isn't possible to have a too light car. It's possible to have a setup that is not suited for a car that light. But the issue is never the weight of the car. The issue is always the setup. Okay, now that I've got that off my chest, let's go to when you don't have the time to fix the setup, what do you actually do? Alright, so adding weight to the front. This is very often done to get more turning from the car, get the front to settle down a bit more, not have as much up and down movement. And generally it's done for a lot of things, but mostly on higher grip tracks. I rarely see people put weight to the front when it's super low grip, mostly when it's high grip. So in theory, what this does is, when you would brake and the load would move to the front tires, you would have just more load on the front tires because the weight bias is moved towards the front. So initial grip will be increased, meaning your car will have slightly better initial turn-in. However, especially on lower grip, having a heavier front end will actually make your car understeer a lot. And I find this quite a lot when I'm at the track and people say, hey, my car is understeering, should I add weight to the front? No, if your car is understeering in the corner, you should never ever add weight to the front. If your car is not turning in, it might help, but most likely the issue you're having isn't you have too little weight on the front, unless of course your weight bias is super rear based. But even then, generally that will just cause oversteer, which we'll go into a second. But considering your weight bias on its own is close to 50-50, adding weight to the front should never increase steering. All that being said, you should realize that some cars have a very strong rear bias, which means that if you add weight to the front, you're just balancing out the car, which means that you will just have more rotation as the weight difference between the front and rear is more balanced. Then the rear end. So it's been really common, I've seen, of people to put an added rear weight in front of the rear gearbox. I see some people use even 30 grams here. I personally tried it a few times just to know how it feels, and it's pretty simple to explain what happens here. So putting more weight towards the rear axle gives you more initial grip for the rear. So going into a corner or the general feel of the car, it will give more load on the rear tires, meaning that you will just have a more stable rear end. However, when the car starts to rotate, having that added weight in the rear will create something I like to call the hammer effect, meaning once you actually start getting the rotation in the car, it just keeps going and going, and you have massive oversteer. this is very noticeable, especially when you put a 30-gram weight in, and especially if your rear grip is already sort of on the edge. So generally, adding weight to the rear, having a more rearward bias, will give you slightly more comfort, like in general situations, but tighter corners, corners where you actually have to rotate the car, you will have this hammer effect. And to me, especially on bumps, it makes the car a lot worse to drive, even though you have slight comfort on some section of the track. Alright, so now that we've gone through both the rear end and the front end and adding weight to either one of those and increasing the bias in either one end of the car, you sort of might catch up onto something that might be building these misconceptions I mentioned earlier on in the video. So people a lot of the times have the idea that adding weight to the front will increase the steering in the car, and if you would add weight to the rear, you would increase the load on the rear tires, which would increase the rear grip of the car. Well, as I explained just then, this isn't always the case. Initially, this effect will be just as I explained just then, but in reality, in most scenarios, when you would start to put more and more load in, you would actually lose grip. So this is not anything crazy or rocket science. It's pretty easy to understand that if you have more mass in one end of the car than the other, once that mass starts to move, it's much harder to stop it. And going through corners, you're trying to rotate your car, meaning you're trying to redirect the mass. So more weight in the rear, you will have the rear oversteer. More weight in the front, you will have the front understeer. So most of you probably know what I'm talking about here, and this is not anything new to you, but I feel like I just come across these misconceptions way too often that I just wanted to talk about this. And now I want to go to something that I find, I wouldn't want to say ridiculous, but to me it feels a bit ridiculous, which is adding weights to unsprung mass. So unsprung mass is mass that is not sprung. Pretty simple. So if you think about hubs, these are connected to the tires, and tires are connected to the ground. And when the tire moves up and down, there's nothing to spring this hub weight. So if you think about the car, when the car is on the ground and the tires move up and down, the shocks act as a spring on the mass of the car, meaning that the motion coming from the tire is not directly affecting the chassis. It's affecting the chassis through a spring and through damping. Well, hubs and in some sense the arms and links and whatever are not affected by the damping, so these are called unsprung mass. So I've seen a lot of these hub weights, pillow ball nuts that are made of brass, hexes that are made of brass, whatever you can think of. Just pretty much adding weights to hubs just to get more unsprung mass. So the idea behind this is to add load straight to the tire so they would push the tire downwards in the corners. It sounds okay when you say like that, but when you start to actually think about what this means, it just means that you're doing this because you can't put enough force on the tires to get the desired amount of traction. So your setup is again wrong, and you're just adding this to compensate for it. And to add on to that, the real issue with adding unsprung mass is the fact that imagine going through a bump. So you have a very heavy object that is unsprung and it hits a bump. So the force that it keeps going up is much higher than the force would be to have an object that would be much lighter. So if you imagine a super light hub and you hit a bump, it just bounces up and it comes down. If you have a super heavy hub, it bounces up and keeps going I think the easiest way to explain the issues with adding unsprung mass is think about our cars and why they have shocks. We have shocks so that when you would hit a bump, hit a jump, whatever, uh, that motion of hitting that bump or jump would not unsettle the car as much. The more you add unsprung mass, you will add more unsettling of the car. Every time you hit a bump, that motion has more force behind it, and meaning your car will be more unsettled. So you would want to have the smallest possible amount of unsprung mass, because every time the suspension moves, there will be a higher percentage of the mass of the car that is not held by the suspension. If you think about this, adding unsprung mass is just pretty much same as reducing damping of your car. We want to have a damping system in our car. Adding unsprung mass is just reducing that. It's slowing down the movement of the tires, which you can do with your shocks. It's adding more load to the tires while cornering, which we can do with roll center and anti-roll bars and springs. And also doesn't really provide any good help with your car. Most of the times these don't really work. You can maybe get a benefit of this, and sometimes it really calms down your car, but that just tells you that something is wrong in your setup. It just tells you that, hey, maybe my setup is too aggressive, maybe my damping is too fast, maybe my spring rate is too high, whatever it is. But if your car works better with more weight on it, maybe it's time to change your setup. Now, obviously, if you're someone who isn't that into tuning your car, or maybe doesn't know much of tuning your car, then yeah, I don't have anything against adding weight. And sometimes I even do it just to save some time. But if you really want to think that you have the best setup possible and you have added weight on the car, maybe you don't have the best setup possible. Anyway, I hope you found something new from this video. This was sort of just one of my pet peeves. But anyway, even after all that, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back to you next week with much more interesting and much more in-depth topics. But anyway, until next time. Alright, I hope you liked that video. If indeed I did actually help you out, please let me know by writing a comment down below. Also, if you like my type of content, feel free to like my Facebook page as well as subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also share it with your friends in social media. Now, if you think I was wrong about something in this video, please let me know. I'll go through all the comments, and I'm really open to differing opinions, and I really want to just spark up a conversation. So with all that, until next time.